Our discussion tonight, and we have tonight and one more week of class before the quarter's over, and so it has become apparent we will not get through Hebrews in this period, so we're going to cover the material in some Sunday morning and Sunday night lessons, so everybody else will get to be a part of that conclusion, but we do want to try at least get through 11 and into 12 tonight so that we can have a shot at least a cursory understanding of that before the quarter's over. I'm going to try something a little different tonight. I always seem to be in our classes going, what does your version say here? What does your version say? So I have this thing that Carla got me for Christmas a few years ago. It is an 8 translation parallel New Testament. And from the King James to the New American Standard, the New Century, Contemporary English, NIV, New Living Translation, New King James, and the Message. So we won't have to do that. The only problem is that all 8 versions are on one page. And I'm going to get confused a time or two, so you'll just have to bear with me as we try to go through here. So we sort of picked up, or we're in the middle of our narratives last week, and we're going to pick up in, I think we got a little farther than this, but let's start with Moses in verse 23. So we're in Hebrews 11:23, and we've been going through this history of Israel. And so before we get into this and into the beginning of, I don't have a microphone, until the beginning of chapter 12, what is the point of the Hebrew writer in this long narrative about the people of faith, the history of Israel? Why is he recounting this? It would almost be like one of our politicians getting up and saying, I want to tell you today in my speech about the days of George Washington. How George Washington went and chopped down a cherry tree. He's the one that chopped down the cherry tree, right? What? Not really, but in the story, right? And the man who had the wooden teeth, supposedly, not true either, but and then we remember that Thomas Jefferson came along and served our country as the President of the United States, and he was the man that framed the Constitution in our country. And we remember how other great men, such as Madison and Monroe, and went down the list. And then we get to Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, and all the things that he did for our country and saved us through a civil war. And we remember in World War II the leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that's all stuff that we know. So what would be the point of a politician getting up and making that speech? Okay, defining a heritage. I think is an important thing. Any of you interested in ancestry? Okay, a few of you. I'll be completely honest. It's not something that fascinates me. I have a pretty simple understanding of where my people came from. A bunch of white people that lived in Alabama, and they probably originally came from Ireland somewhere. It's pretty simple. But there are people who are fascinated with that stuff. My mom is one of those people. She has books this thick about our heritage back, and there's some Native American ancestry and stuff that's interesting, but it's not something that fascinates me. But there are people that spend every waking moment trying to trace their lineage because their heritage, their ancestry is important to them. To those of you that do that, why is that so important to you? Ms. Betty?
John Steinbeck wrote, "How will our children know where they're going if they don't know where they've been? If we don't know what's gone before us."
How long have you been saving that quote to use it in Bible class? That was like something you watch on PBS. Man, that was so insightful. So John Steinbeck said, if we don't teach our children where we've come from, they won't know where they're going. I think that's very important. What else? Why do you trace your ancestry?
Well, it was really important in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that kind of gets us to our point here. He's trying to help them see their history and where they came from. Now, so that would be, I believe, one purpose. Okay, yeah. Well, I don't think that's the case here, but certainly that's what you do. So what do you think then if a politician got up and made this speech about the history of the presidents and how great the nation was? What's the second purpose of him priming the pump with that part of the speech? That he's better? Okay. And you laugh at that, but I think when we get to chapter 12, we're kind of going to see that. Because that president or that politician is buttering you up to drop something new on you about how all those things have happened, but now it's time for the country to take the next step. In the footsteps of great men like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, we're going to take this next step. That's exactly what the Hebrew writer is doing here. He's giving us this ancestry, this lineage, all this that we need to see who the mighty men and women of Israel were, and in some cases not of Israel, right? And he's going to, and then in chapter 12, he's going to drop a bomb on them, right? And say, because of this, this is how we need to act in this new understanding of the faith moving forward. And so I hope that as we read this, that we see it for what it's worth, a description of the history, but we also see where the ship is being steered. Gerald? Mm-hmm. Therefore, yep. Yeah, because of all this, let's get ready. So anyway, let's finish reading 21. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he'd grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And these are all things we know. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. If you're an underlining person in your Bible, underline that sentence. That is one of the most powerful sentences of faith in all of Scripture. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of, and you could erase Egypt and put in whatever you want to there. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. So these are the foundations of the nation here, right? Coming out of captivity. And then he's going to say, and by faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Continuing in the heritage, and this is a pretty big jump because now Moses is gone, and by faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people marched around them for 7 days. So he's not directly saying his name, but who's he talking about here? Joshua, absolutely, right? By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Now when I read this, I'm following along, and I'm good with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Joshua, but then the writer throws a monkey wrench in this whole deal, right? So why stick Rahab in here? Okay, I think so, but before we even get to that, what are the two basic things that we know about Rahab? What'd she do for a living? Prostitute. A lot of people will argue that. I think the Bible's pretty clear on that. What else do we know that she did when the man came knocking on her door? So she's a prostitute and a liar. And yet we're going Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, prostitute, liar. Now, that's a bit strange, is it not? So help me understand why that's included. I've always thought that was interesting. Thank you. We are not defined by those things. We're defined, as Miss Ann said, by our faith. And I think this is perhaps the greatest reminder of that. That is a perfect description. So by faith, the prostitute Rahab. So we're talking about faith here, not mistakes, not a job, not something that she did. And we could talk about the theological consequences of her lying another night. But Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. So because she hid the spies, her life was saved. What more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon. Very quickly, who's Gideon? Okay, hero of the book of Judges. Remember the odds that were against his fate? What were the numbers? Yeah, pretty interesting odds. You remember all the things that they kept whittling down the size of his army? Do you remember who he was fighting against? Midianites. Good job, Miss Clea. Yeah, so we know the story of Gideon, and it's interesting because initially we see Gideon as what? Coward. So prostitute and the coward here are next on the list. What about Barack? President of the United States for 8 years, right? Who was this guy?
General of the army that was supposed to go fight wouldn't go to the stick.
Yeah, so here's another cowardly guy, right? And so I was reading some stuff about this last week, and I was sort of wanting to hear what people had to say. And kind of the popular opinion was that the reason that he's included in this list is he had the wisdom to know that Deborah was God's chosen. So sometimes faith can be displayed not just in action, but in wisdom and obedience. So I just thought that was interesting. But of course, he was the general of the army, fought in the time of Deborah. These are not in chronological order, by the way, when you're going through and reading the book of Judges. Samson, we know about Samson, another real bright guy, right? What do we know about Samson? Just a quick history of the narrative. Say it. A dummy, yeah, that's right. More strength than brains. These are all things that are sounding very typical of men. What was his weakness? Women. That's another thing that's very typical, right? And what ended up happening to him? Had his hair cut off. What else? Yeah, eyes gouged out. And he died. How did he die? Under the weight of a building that he pulled down, right? But yet he's remembered as a great man of faith. Why? Yeah, absolutely. Because his mistakes, as was pointed out, are not the sum total of his identity. It's about his faith. So this next one's really good. Who is our next character there? What do we know about Jephthah? I think this is in 5 and 6 of Judges. Somebody can double check me on that. But so the story of Jephthah was that he promised, if God granted him victory, that he would sacrifice to God the first thing that he saw upon his return. First thing that he saw was his daughter. And a lot of people have a lot of trouble with his inclusion in this list because he's a man that killed his child. So why then is he included in this list? Okay, what else? Okay, turn to Judges 5 really quick. I want to read the verse that sort of jumps out. Am I in the right chapter? I might be. 11, I'm sorry, Judges 11. You're right. Ooh, the print gets smaller in this Bible every time I use it. Nope, I don't. Judges is like 2 pages in here. Is this what y'all do when your vision, you do close and then put far away? Okay, Judges 11. I'll have to find the verse. Right. That's the verse. Thank you. Verse 35 of Judges 11. I've slept since I looked at this. It's the last statement there. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you've brought me down and I am devastated." But it's that last sentence. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break. Made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break. That is what identifies him as a person of faith. Not the action, because the action we sometimes find reprehensible, but it's the obedience to God that I've made a promise and I'm going to keep it. What about in the story of Hannah? What was the promise that Hannah made? God granted her a child that she would give him to. Can you imagine all the praying that went into that child being born? And then he's born, and she hands him off to the priest. But it was a vow of faith that was made, and they kept that vow. And that's why Jephthah is included in this list. Any other comments on that? I know that's a sort of a lot to take in. Questions or comments? Would anybody disagree with Jephthah being a person of faith? Would anybody do things differently?
Don't make that kind of vow. If you can't keep it, don't make that kind of
Certainly
vow.
not, no, Jesus said, do not forswear yourself, that's King James,
Mhm.
but the same thing, it's like, watch out what you're swearing about.
Yeah.
Careful what you say.
Yeah, be careful what you promise. But anyway, that's an interesting one of those things that's brought up all the time. Do what now? Yeah, she could have run away, right? But if you go, she says, well, if that promise was made, then, it's kind of the same thing that we talked about with Isaac, isn't it? I think we always assume that when Abraham took Isaac up on the mountain to sacrifice him, that he was just a little bitty toddler that had no idea what was going on. He would have been old enough to partake in the journey himself. And so for him to obey his father and go and lay on the slab to be sacrificed, I think is another example of exactly what you're talking about. Okay, next on our list, David. We know, of course, of the great things that David did. Samuel and the prophets. We know, of course, about Samuel's great legacy. We talked about him in our lesson Sunday afternoon. And the prophets, we could go and make a list of the prophets. And so here's kind of the, this is the cool part of the chapter to me. He's talking about all that Israel achieved here. He's talked about the cast of characters, but now he's going to switch to the list of achievements. Who through their faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. They shut the mouths of lions. Who did that? Daniel. Quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, who became powerful in battle, who routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging. Others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. He's given a list there of almost 20 things. We stopped counting, at least I did at 16, of all these things that all these people endured, all this suffering, all this persecution, physical and emotional. But he also lists the great things that were accomplished through their sacrifice. Jumping down to 38. Let me turn my little page here. 38. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. These were all commended for their faith. I mean, if this was a speech, and we think this was, right? Remember we said that one of the possibilities that we think this was probably a sermon that had been transcribed? Can you imagine this part of the sermon? Where all the things that were conquered and the mouths of the lions were held shut, and just this sort of ultimate climax to this lesson, right? And these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Man, you're way up here in the lesson, and then you bring it down. None of them received what had been promised. What does that mean? What's he trying to say? Yeah. They had not received the promise of Christ.
We have received more than what they received, and they were so greater than us, but we have received it.
Yeah, I think so. He's getting ready to drop a whammy. Let me give you a piece of advice. If you're ever listening to a lesson or a speech, and the person goes, and especially if it's somebody that can discipline you, if you ever hear them get really loud and then really soft, you're in trouble, right? Anybody have parents like that? Yeah, I bet. That they get real loud and then they get real quiet. The loud you can handle, but the quiet is what scares you, right? Excuse me. They had not received what had been promised. And so you can sort of, sometimes, and this happens to y'all because I can see you when I'm preaching. Sometimes the lesson is sort of in the same, not monotone so much, but, sort of in the same register of volume and cadence. And some of your eyes get a little heavy, and especially on a Sunday night or Sunday afternoon after lunch, and your eyes get a little heavy and you're not really paying attention. But then every now and then, myself or whoever's preaching that day will say something that you go, wait a minute now. There's that one thing that catches your attention. I remember growing up, for some reason, the preacher's illustrations about his own personal life always got my attention. Whenever somebody would, the practical application to something that happened in his real life always got me. And then sermon illustrations, of course, always I really enjoyed. And so every now and then something will be said that perks our ears up. And we'll go, wait a second, that's kind of different from what he's been saying. This is the intention of this. These were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Larger than life heroes, joined together with us. And we have been given something, and Brent made this point, we've been given something greater. And so this would have been, one of those things that left them on the edge of their seats. So he says all that, this great rallying cry about the history of people of faith, all God's people, the Israelites, and all that had come down, and kings and prophets and conquerors and all that. And he says, and they didn't receive the promise, but you together with them have made them perfect as Christians. Therefore, so here's the application. Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So here's the application. Here's the part of the lesson where he really wants them to listen and hang on. So he says, if we are joined and linked together with all these people, by Christ being the fulfillment, here's how we have to live our lives. I just want to use this illustration. This is one of those verses that I've heard people try to use to justify to say why Paul would have written Hebrews. What does Hebrews 12:1 remind you of? Something else that Paul may have written. Sorry.
Run the good race and fought the good fight.
Yeah. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Right? I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I've kept the faith. What else? What else did Paul write about that had to do with an athletic competition? Disciplining your body, running. Anybody remember where those were in context of? I used this Sunday morning in the lesson. It's in one of the books where there's two of them. No. Good, try that. No? Here. No? Yes. So when did Paul write 1 and 2 Peter? Man. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 24 through 27. Remember that? He talks about, when he's talking about the great races that went on in Corinth and how they could receive a temporary crown, but the permanent crown was coming. So this sounds like a very Paul thing to say, right? And that's one of the verses that people use. But he says, let's throw off everything that hinders, or let us, the New King James, which I grew up with, says, we also, since we're surrounded by so great witnesses, let us lay aside every weight. Lay aside every weight. We had Veterans Day on Sunday and Monday. Who here was in the military? What was that big bag that you carried around when you had to go running? Duffel bag? What? I thought it used to be called something else. I always heard a rucksack. Was that an Army thing? A sea bag is what the Navy called it. Kenny, what was that comment you made? No, don't say it again. I'm sorry. I don't want to get you in trouble. Marines, what'd y'all call it? A rucksack. Okay. Army, anybody in the Army? A what now? A duffel bag. Air Force? Oh, y'all didn't carry any. No, I'm just kidding. What did the Air Force carry? Their helmet? What was it? Duffel bag. Okay. A kit bag. Okay. So I remember growing up, you had easy access to Fort Benning. It's not like now, post 9/11, where nobody can get on the base without an ID, but used to. There was a bicycle trail, and my dad and I used to ride on this trail, and you would just cross over this street, and you went from being in Columbus to being on Fort Benning. You'd be riding your bike on Fort Benning, and here comes all the privates with these big bags, and they're just running, carrying these big bags. And they were huge. I don't know, how much did one of those bags weigh? 40 pounds? Anybody else weighs any different? Marines were probably like 80 or 90 pounds, weren't they? Just because somebody can swim, Rob, they think that they're better than everybody else. Right? No, so imagine that you've been carrying all day this big bag, and you're running, and then your commanding officer says, just throw it on the ground and keep running. You would never have run as fast as you could without that. It's one of those reasons, if you ever go to a baseball game, and there's a guy in the on-deck circle, and he's got this big ring on his bat, and now actually they I think, have weighted bats that you can swing, and he's swinging that. Why is he swinging that weighted, heavy bat with the weight on it? Yeah, make his own bat feel lighter, and he's able to swing it with more authority. And so he's saying here to throw off all those things that can hold us back, because we need to be running at full speed this race that's set before us. This path that we've been given to follow, that's by all those great witnesses that were before us, this path that we need to follow, anything that's holding us back, we've got to take it off and go as fast as we can. He's trying to help us understand that. Yes, sir. So there is a verse in Ecclesiastes that says that the dead have no interest in the things of this world. Somebody might look it up real fast. I believe it's in chapter 7 somewhere. And so for a long time, that's been the standard answer to that question, is that the dead have no interest in the things of the world, and so there's no way that anybody that's gone on before us can see things going on in the world. When Michael was here doing his Teaching Rocket seminar, he made a point, and it may have gone past everybody else, but it really stuck out to me, that we have to be careful of making doctrinal determinations based on a piece of poetry. And so when you read things in Proverbs and Psalms, it doesn't make them not true, but we have to remember that they're prose instead of doctrinal determinations and facts. And so I think it would be hard for us to read the book of Ecclesiastes and pick out one verse and set our doctrine about whether or not people in heaven can see things on the earth based on that one verse. You see what I'm saying about that? Yeah. And so, we know that according to other things we read in Scripture that the dead have consciousness. And so I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibility that those people that have gone on have the ability to notice what we're doing. And so not only inspiring, but encouraging us to do so. Now, I don't think we have any communication with the dead. If you're somebody that believes in ghosts, and I know some of you do, bless your heart. There are people making money off you. So I don't believe in any of that. But when he says we're surrounded, it doesn't make it seem like that there's a great disconnect between us and those others, does it? I'd be interested to hear your opinions about that. That's a great question. What do you think?
I just think we have the information about these witnesses. I mean, we just have it previous that we can read about. We have historical information about.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think, though, in general, about this idea of whether or not those that have gone on have an awareness of what's going on in the world? Jonathan?
Well, you remember about the rich man and Lazarus being in a place of torment and a place of peace. If the man in torment could remember his family and want to go back to save his family, so to speak, it would stand to reason that he would know that his family was not in a safe state. So if he can remember that, if he can be conscious of that, if he can know that about his family, he can see God living right. Maybe after he died, he can still see that happening, because we don't really have a realm of time, a time frame to build around how long he was in this place of torment. He could have been watching his family do things that were not appropriate and want to go change that.
Yeah.
So if that's a possibility, and you go through and list some 25 odd heroes of faith that are now dead, if they could see what's going on, they could be watching. It would make sense to me why you would list all these people who've done all these amazing things that are now watching you, because they are a witness to your actions. Your actions are important.
And don't we use that as a motivational? If your dad could see you right now, he'd be rolling over in his grave, right? We use that as a motivational tactic. And so, and first off, let me say, I think this whole discussion is hypothetical. I don't think there is a lot eschatologically that we know about the end of time or things going on in the heaven. I don't think that we can sit here and say, well, this is exactly how it is in heaven, and we, we can't do that.
We're in heaven and we're not going to know any sorrow. It's going to be a wonderful, happy place. I can't think that if I was sitting in heaven, I would be happy to look down and see my kids weren't there.
Yeah.
Or see what they were doing. I don't think
That's a great point. Brent?
Wouldn't, the story of Lazarus in Hades, that would add to his pain and suffering to know that his brothers, according to what they're doing down there, they're gonna be right there with me.
Mhm.
I mean, and he would, that would add to, I mean, if hell ain't bad enough for us, if we can look back and see that our kids or our family is doing the same thing and not gonna go to the other side, they're gonna be here with me, that is more suffering that you gotta endure.
Yeah.
it doesn't say that Lazarus was.
Yeah.
But
That-
it never stated that he could see them. It said send word to them not to come to this place.
Right. Right. Yeah. Daniel?
Could it be also maybe that, since you kind of know all the cool stuff they did by your actions, don't put that to shame or
Yeah.
friendship or church type of thing because you see what they did. So if you don't do that, you're going to make us do that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's part of it. I don't know. I've always been fascinated. The thing that always jumps out in my mind is it says when a sinner repents that there's rejoicing with the angels in heaven. You sort of imagine people in heaven and the angels are angels. What are y'all rejoicing about? Nothing. Nothing. Shh, nothing. Nothing. You can't see this. I don't know. But I've always wondered about that. What is the relationship between those that have gone on versus, I don't believe there's any communication, but can they see? Are they aware? I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, I don't know. But I do think that's interesting phrasing there. We're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. And remember, if you remember the terminology about heaven in this time, that there was a first heaven, remember this? And the second heaven and the third heaven. What was the first heaven? The birds fly in the clouds. So does that have something to do? A great cloud of witnesses that reside in the. I don't know what the language is there, but anyway.
It can be more now with our modern technology. People talk about using the cloud. You use the cloud or you just use your own personal computer. And I see it very appropriate what he's saying there. We have got in the cloud
Oh, I never thought about that.
a lot of evidence.
I mean, that's a good sermon idea right there.
I mean, your word process,
Yeah.
it's in the cloud, but there's a lot of evidence.
Things stored in the cloud. Hebrews. There we go. That's pretty good. Okay, so now that we've sufficiently gotten off on a tangent, and let me just say, whatever you feel about that, I'm okay with. I don't want people to leave here and go, preacher, I don't know how I even feel about it, but it's something that all of us have thought about, that relationship. But anyhow, so we're surrounded by this great cloud of, we have their example, and because of that, we know the faith that they had, and it should inspire us to have that same faith. Let's throw off the weight. And so we're following the path. And here's another one of those let us. Anybody remember how many let us statements in the book of Hebrews? Same as the chapters. Good job. 13 let us statements. So let us fix or focus our eyes on Jesus. Let us focus our eyes on Jesus. I took Mila yesterday to go get her shots. And so the nurse came in and said, all right, if you'll lay her on this table, I'm going to give her a shot. She came in with the needles. And she looked at me and she said, all right, now you stand over the top at her and you look at her and talk to her. So she'll focus on you. And I thought, I want her to hate you. I don't want her to hate me. I said, you look at her and talk to her while you stab her. So, but when our children focus on us, right? Any of you ever taught your kids to swim? You're sitting there, you don't look at the water, you focus on me and you jump and I'll catch you. And then a bunch of terrible people let the kid hit the water anyway, right? But it's that focusing. So it says our focus then, when we're running this race, when we're trying to have faith, is our focus needs to be on who? On Christ. Not just the example of these people, because these people were just people, but now we have an even better example. It's the example of Christ for us to focus on, right? And here's a descriptor of Jesus as the author and perfecter of our faith. What does that mean to you? Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. That's one of those phrases that we've used, and I have a sneaky suspicion in 2019 you'll hear that again, maybe in a summer series lesson. What does that mean to you? The author and perfecter of our faith, or the author, or the, what do the other versions say? Author and finisher of our faith. What does that mean?
Yes, he says founder and perfecter of our faith.
The founder and perfecter of our faith. It is? What now? Beginning and end. I think that's a good way to think about it too. That faith resides in Jesus Christ. Who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So we've transitioned here, right? Remember in 7, 8, 9, and 10, we were comparing covenants. Now we're comparing examples. You've got this great cloud of witnesses that I've just spent all this time talking about, and they're wonderful examples, and you should look to them. But there's a greater example to follow, and the greater example is Jesus. So we've compared covenants, now we're comparing examples. We're comparing those that we should follow. In your struggle, verse 4, against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood, and you have forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as sons. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines those he loves and punishes everyone he accepts as a son. That's from Proverbs, the 3rd chapter. So endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you're illegitimate children and not true sons. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they ought best, but God disciplines us for good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Now, I struggle with this, I'll just tell you. Because I have no idea what God's discipline is. There are people that would stand up here and say, well, God's discipline is in the form of things like natural disasters and pain and suffering that comes upon you and your family. And I just tell you, I don't believe that for a minute. I don't think that God intentionally brings about disaster and famine and to discipline us and do. I think those things happen because of the natural order of things, and because of people's choices, and because of things that human beings do. So then, what is this talking about? We know the earthly side of it, right? There's this new research that came out just the other day from the American Association of Pediatrics, or whatever the organization is called, that said no more spanking kids, right? Just in time for me to have a baby. Now you're not allowed to spank them anymore, right? Because it just messes them up and turns them all into psycho killers, right? Raise your hand if you received a spanking as a child. All right, now everybody look and see whose hand's not up. We know who the bad kids were. Okay, no. There's not a lot of, there's a few, but there's not a lot of psycho killers in this room, right? And I was disciplined. I never thought it was abuse, and I always deserved it, and probably deserved more than I got. And discipline was good. And now, partly because of discipline, I am at least a somewhat normal functioning member of society. Would we agree with that? And I don't want to know your political positions on spanking, because it's a political issue now, like everything, but that was something that, so we all understand discipline. Even if you're not a person that spanks, and if you're a parent that doesn't spank, I'm okay with that. There's other forms of discipline. I have a good friend whose spanking didn't work, and so when her son acts up, they take him and they put him in the shower. Not with the shower on, just in the shower with the curtain closed. And that's what they do to get him to act right. If you got teenagers, what do you do to discipline your teenagers now? Take away their cell phone, and they will cry and scream. You can't send them to their room because that's where all the toys are, right? But there's other forms of discipline. But we all understand discipline, don't we? Sherry, you had your hand up.
I was gonna tell you something, a very smart preacher told me when I was still raising my kids.
Oh, it wasn't me. Okay. Go ahead.
No, he's older than you. He said, if you don't discipline your children and teach them, what is proper in society, you who love your children, somebody later on down the road is gonna come along and discipline them, and they don't love them.
Yeah. I think it's a valid point. Okay, so I think that bell means we're out of time. Jonathan, go ahead, and then we'll dismiss.
I heard a very similar thing said by another preacher. If you don't discipline your children when they're your children, when they're adults, the cops will do it for you.
That's right. That's right. So let's pick up on this discussion next week and think about what godly discipline might mean. I think that's an interesting point for discussion. And then actually, it won't be next week. Next week will be our Thanksgiving service. So in 2 weeks, we'll pick up there. If you don't mind, let's have a word of prayer before we dismiss. God, we thank you tonight for the discussion of your word, even though we're having to move through maybe more quickly than we would like. We pray that we can apply it to our lives, that we can see the lives of these great people of faith and try to focus on you more by their example and just strive to be the people you would have us to be. Be with us throughout the rest of this week, and it's through your Son we pray. Amen.